10,000 years ago, on the shore of a lake in what is now northern Kenya, 27 people died. Nobody buried them. Their bodies were left exactly where they fell, until water and sediment slowly closed over the site and, without meaning to, preserved it. Nobody touched that ground again until a team of archaeologists stumbled onto it in 2012. And what they found forced a rewrite of one of the oldest debates in anthropology. Were humans ever peaceful by default, before civilization supposedly taught us to fight? The place is called Nataruk, about 30 kilometers from the current shore of Lake Turkana. Back then, the lake extended much further and the site sat at the edge of a lagoon in territory rich enough to support a real population of hunter-gatherers. In 2012, researchers from Cambridge's Leverhulme Center for Human Evolutionary Studies were working the area when they found something they weren't looking for. Human remains, sitting exactly where they'd fallen, never buried. 27 individuals in total. Men, women, at least 6 children. When the team looked closely at the 12 best preserved skeletons, 10 of them told the same story in the language bones used to describe violence. Crushed cheekbones and skulls from blunt force blows, broken hands, knees, ribs, wounds to the neck consistent with arrows, and in 2 of the men, stone projectile points still lodged in the skull and the chest. 2 of those points were made of obsidian, black volcanic glass, sharpened to a razor edge. 4 of the 12 appeared to have died with their hands bound. One of them was a woman in the final stages of pregnancy. Nobody buried these people. Their bodies were left on the edge of the lagoon until the water and sediment slowly closed over them and preserved the scene for 10,000 years. That detail matters almost as much as the injuries themselves. A community that buries its dead is telling you something about how those deaths were understood. A community that leaves its dead exactly where they fell, unburied, is usually telling you the opposite, that whoever survived either couldn't come back for them, or never intended to. Here's why this matters more than one grim discovery. Nataruk dates to the early Holocene, before agriculture reached this part of Africa, before permanent settlements, before anything resembling a state. These were hunter-gatherers. No stored grain worth raiding in the way later farming societies had. No city walls. No king giving orders. For a long time, the working assumption in anthropology was simple. Organized group violence was something civilization invented. Once you had farming property and hierarchy, you got war. Before that, the thinking went, small mobile bands had neither the numbers nor the motive to kill each other in groups. Nataruk is one of the strongest pieces of physical evidence against that assumption. If people without any of the supposed prerequisites for war were still capable of this, the appetite for organized violence isn't something agriculture created. It's something agriculture inherited. So what were they actually fighting over? The archaeologist who led the original research team has pointed to the site itself for an answer. The Nataruk Lagoon sat in unusually rich territory with reliable water, fish, and game in a landscape that was otherwise drying out as the climate shifted at the end of the last ice age. Her team's reading is that this was a resource conflict, an attempt by one group to seize territory, food, and the people of another, the same categories of prize that would later drive wars between farming societies with granaries and treasuries. The tools were simpler. The motive, it turns out, may not have been. To the question of whether people back then fought like we do now, the honest answer is no. Not remotely. There were no armies here, no ranks, no lines. What the evidence actually points to is something closer to a raid or an ambush. One group descending on another, smaller and unable to fight back effectively, and not stopping until nearly everyone was dead. Not a battle, a massacre. That distinction matters, because it tells us something about what early violence between groups actually looked like. Not two forces clashing head-on, but the strong overwhelming the vulnerable, at close range with whatever weapons were on hand. And that obsidian point is its own small mystery. The nearest natural sources of obsidian are a real distance from Nataruk, which means whoever attacked this group either carried the material with them, or acquired it through contact, or trade far beyond their immediate territory. 10,000 years ago, on foot, that is not a small detail. It hints at a world of hunter-gatherer bands already connected, and apparently, already capable of turning those connections lethal. Nataruk isn't an isolated case, either. Further north, in what is now Sudan, a cemetery called Jebel Sahaba tells a related story from a similar stretch of prehistory. More than 5 dozen individuals were buried there, and a large share show injuries from projectile weapons, some old and healed, some fresh at the time of death. For years, Jebel Sahaba was read the same way as Nataruk. One decisive battle, one bad day. A newer analysis published in 2021 revised that picture. Many of the injuries had healed long before death, meaning these people survived earlier attacks and were hit again later. The current reading is a slow drumbeat of raids and ambushes spread across years, not a single clash, likely driven by the same kind of pressure the Cambridge team proposed for Nataruk, a changing climate, shrinking resources, and neighboring groups increasingly willing to take by force what they couldn't otherwise get. Now, the honest complication. Not every archaeologist accepts the Nataruk massacre interpretation outright. A few years after the original publication, other researchers published a formal challenge. They argued the skeletons might not all date to the exact same event, and they questioned whether some of the skull damage credited to blunt force blows might instead be the result of 10,000 years of burial pressure from wet lagoon sediment, rather than a blow received the day they died. The original team has stood by their reading of the evidence, and the broader pattern from sites like Jebel Sahaba makes their case harder to dismiss. But it's a genuine, ongoing scientific argument, worth knowing, because the honest answer to whether this happened exactly the way it's usually described is that most of the evidence says yes, and a minority of experts say we should slow down before we're certain. Even with that caveat, Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba together push the timeline of organized human violence back further than almost anything else we've found, and they do it without a single wall, weapon cache, or written record. Just what was left of people who never got the chance to be buried properly. Long before there were nations to declare war, there were small bands on the edges of lakes and rivers, competing for the same shrinking resources, and settling that competition with whatever weapons they had on hand. Whatever war is, it seems it didn't wait for civilization to invent it. It was already here, waiting on us, long before we had our word for it.